Let us turn our attention now to processing and learning for these neural network models. So processing, to start with, is going to consist of the passing of activation. Right? So individual neural units have activation values, and they will then pass their activation values on to the next layer and on until you get from input to output. Now there are two sorts of ways in which activation gets passed through two different kinds of functions, linear functions and threshold functions. And we'll talk about those very briefly as well. Once activation is being passed, it will be modified by connection weights. So every unit is connected to every other unit in the next layer, and each of those connections is going to have a specific weighting, and that activation function will then take that activation, weight it in accordance with the weight between each unit, and then pass that weighted activation to the next unit. Learning, as we'll see, consists in reorganizing the system by modifying those weights between the connections between the individual units. Weight modification is generally accomplished through training, and training can be done in one of two ways, either supervised training or unsupervised training. But in general, training always is experience modifying weights between individual units within a system. So the input to a system is represented by some pattern of activation over the input layer. And generally, there are two ways of presenting activation to inputs. You can fix the level of activation to the inputs, and this is sometimes called clamping, or you can present the input and let it slowly decay as time goes by. Activation can be either discrete, in which case the values range across some small set of possible values, usually 0 and 1, or maybe 1 through 10, things of that nature. Or activation can be continuous, in which case the activation values are some real value or approximation on the rationals of a real value. Activation of each layer is then passed to successive layers through discrete time units until activation for each unit becomes relatively stable. This process is called relaxation and ends in settling. Each unit in the input layer and all of the subsequent layers uses its input to calculate its current level of activation and then to generate an output. And there are two general ways for units to calculate activation. Activation will flow from one unit to the next all the way through the system like this, and it'll do so in accordance with one of these two patterns. Units compute activation either by a linear function, for example, equating the activation with the input so that the unit's activation is just the sum of its inputs, or by using a threshold function in which the system doesn't have any activity until the summed input to the unit reaches a certain level, and then it becomes activated. In either case, activation will be presented to the input. It will then calculate its activation, pass its activation to the next unit, and the next unit will only become activated if it's a threshold function once it gets a sufficient amount of input, and then it may pass its activation on to the next. Units compute their output to any other unit, right? So notice that this unit is connected to each of the units in the successive layer, here our output layer, and that output is the activation of that unit multiplied by the weight between that unit and the unit is passing its activation to. So if a unit has an activation, say of 0.9, and a weight between itself and another unit of 0.5, then the output, the activation that it transmits to that next unit will be 0.45, 0.9 times 0.5. So here we've got activation of two input units. They then reach the threshold for the activation of that next hidden layer unit, and then it will pass on its activation to the final unit. Each time those activations will be modified by multiplying them by the weight between the two units. What about learning? Well, all successful self-organizing systems, including biological ones, have an implicit objective function. During the learning process, the system changes its organization so as to move closer towards the optimal values of that function. Presumably, the function is the cognitive function from the cognitive theory for the task. And functions, of course, need not be optimal. They merely need to be sufficiently above chance. So the general approach to learning and neural network modeling equates learning with weight adjustment. Weight adjustment problems are solved in a neural network model by an ordered triple, that is, by the architecture, the dynamics, and the parameter adjustment procedures. So different types of neural networks will implement different learning procedures. Altering weights between connections can be thought of as mimicking a number of different aspects of brain learning. So it can be thought of as mimicking the growth of dendritic branches between neurons, changes in the synaptic density on existing dendrites, and or long-term potentiation, that is, changes to one cell's ability to depolarize, excite another cell as a result of experience. And that's also a process associated with learning in human beings. Weight modification is accomplished by general learning rules. And there are two classes of such rules. There are supervised learning rules and unsupervised learning rules. Supervised learning rules adjust weights in the system in response to explicit external feedback with regard to the system's performance. So the system will respond to a particular input. Its response will be evaluated relative to the correct output, and then weights will be adjusted by adjusting weights in accordance with the error that they are thought to have generated in the output. Unsupervised rules alter weights without such external feedback, oftentimes because they get associations between the activation patterns of two different neurons.